Hey guys, this is Kendall Terry, and this is Evolution Part 3, specifically looking at how we name the organisms that we see and come in contact with in science. So the first is what's in a name. Taxonomy is the science of naming and classifying organisms, and this really comes from Carlos Linnaeus. Carlos Linnaeus was a Swedish biologist that developed the simple system of naming organisms. And you can see here on the screen, the system he developed is called binomial nomenclature, and it's a two-word system for naming. It uses two categories that he developed called the genus and the species. And this is, you capitalize the genus, species is lowercase, and then if you're typing it, it would be italicized. So for instance, humans are Homo sapiens. So Homo is our genus, sapien is our species, and that's how you look at the organisms you come in contact with. And this is important because when you start looking at organisms around the world, you might call something, for instance, a bear, but in another country, the word bear may stand for something different than what you think of when you use the term bear. So this system of naming puts everything on an equal playing field. It gives everything a structured name using primarily Greek and Latin naming, so that we understand what that organism is, and everybody's using the same name for that organism. He also developed classifications. Now, Carlos Linnaeus was involved in developing 7 of those classifications, and that would have started here with kingdom. But there's been another category that has been added and is used a lot as well, and it's called domain. So we've got the domain, then we've got kingdom, phylum, class, order, family, genus, species. As you go from domain to species, you get more and more and more specific. As you go from species up to domain, you get more and more and more general in your term. So here's a picture of that. We start up here with the kingdom. Now, there's actually one above this one called the domain, but it's not mentioned on here. And then you go kingdom. Now you see kingdom, the bear, for instance, the grizzly bear, is in the kingdom Animalia. And you can see there's various things in that kingdom, and we're in that kingdom as well. Then you would go to phylum Chordata. The Chordata is one that we're in. Class Mammalia. And you can see as you go down this list, we're getting more and more specific to what we're looking at. Order Carnivora. Family Ursidae, genus Ursus, and then finally species is the Arctos, and that scientific name is mentioned right here, Ursus arctos. So that is the grizzly bear. So you can see how as you go down, you're getting more and more and more specific, more and more similarities in the organisms that fit into that category. Up here at the top, Kingdom Animalia, big version, a big name that a lot of organisms that may not necessarily look that much alike are in, and down at the bottom, very specific with only one organism left that fits those characteristics. And those characteristics could be very general and interesting at times. Sometimes they're not even that noticeable. You have to really dig deep sometimes to see the similarities and differences in these organisms. So evolutionarily speaking, which is what this whole unit has been about, why do we want to know their name? Why do we want to give them a name? And what is it? How does it all come together? Well, we'll start with the understanding of what a biological species is. A biological species is a group of actually or potentially interbreeding natural populations that are reproductively isolated from other such groups. Now, that's a big definition to say that it's organisms that can reproduce fertile offspring. Now, this definition fits well with most of the organisms that you're going to find in Kingdom Animalia. As you get outside of the animal species and you get into like plants and other organisms, this definition is not that great because there's so much interbreeding that can go on in other organisms. But in the Kingdom Animalia, this definition works really well. And it helps us to understand, at the end of the day, relatedness, because organisms may look very similar, but that doesn't necessarily put them in the same species, and it doesn't necessarily put them even as a close ancestor. For instance, you can have similar traits, but not a common ancestor, and those traits come from convergent evolution. Now remember, we talked about divergent, where they have a common ancestor, and you split from that during reproductive isolation or speciation. Convergent evolution is organisms evolving similar features independently because of similar habitats. And you can think of, they're starting in different places, and as they evolve to their environment, they become more and more and more similar to each other. Now, the most common example of that is the dolphin and the shark. The dolphin and the shark look very, very similar, but when you really start to break down what makes up their characteristics, they are not similar at all. In fact, they're made up of what we call analogous characters. Analogous characters, you can see right here in the green on the screen, analogous characters are similar features that evolve through convergent evolution. So, for instance, with the dolphin and the shark, you've got flippers, okay, here and here, or fins, you could say. Well, they look very similar, but when you start to break them down and look at what they're really made up of and how they got to that point, what we find is they look similar because they live in a similar environment, the ocean. In fact, these live in environments that they'll even come in contact with each other. But they've evolved those because those are best suited for that environment, not because they were closely related. That is something completely different. Now, when we're studying these organisms, what we like to look at is phylogeny, the evolutionary history of a species. And as we understand evolutionary history, we understand more about their naming and their classification system, and that's where all of this ties in. So when we look at the shark and the dolphin, they are analogous structures, and we want to understand, well, what about them? What are they closely related to then? What can we group them with if it's not each other? Because you actually wouldn't group the dolphin and the shark together in classification schemes. You wouldn't group them together much at all. In fact, they would only be together for a couple categories. You'd have Animalia. They're both in the Animalia category. And then when you start to go down, they really start to spread out on classification schemes, and it's because of their phylogeny, their evolutionary history, what they're really made up of, not necessarily what they look like on the outside. Outside appearance can be confusing and misleading. You have to look at, you have to go deeper than physical characteristics. So what do we use? How do we know? What can we do? Well, what we use is a system called cladistics. Cladistics is a system of taxonomy, which is naming, a system of naming that reconstructs phylogeny or evolutionary history by inferring relationships based on similarities. So now we look at what we call derived characters, or characters that gave them an edge, evolutionarily speaking, and separated them from others. So when you look at this cladogram here on the screen, and we're actually going to work on one of these in class, all of these here are animals. They're all involved in the kingdom Animalia. But the very first derived character, meaning everybody from this point up or to the right, has a jaw. The hagfish is an animal that does not have a jaw. Its mouth is just open. It doesn't have the ability to close it. So from here on, everything up has a jaw, and that jaw allows it to open and close its mouth. So the next thing then you see is the perch. And then the thing that derived, or the thing that separated the rest of these from the perch, is the evolutionary adaptation of the lung. So now you have a lung that enables breathing air instead of water. So now you get the everything from salamander up to chimp, and then claws or nails. Salamanders do not have claws or nails, so they're cut out. But everybody above this does have claws or nails. And then we break the pigeon off. Now sometimes that break will be here. Other times it will actually just split from the lizard line. But we say the evolutionary adaptation of feathers for birds. And then finally, this last one up here, fur and mammary glands, and you've got the mouse and the chimp. So if you look at this picture and you say, well, what is most closely related evolutionarily, you would go with the two that are most closely related or have the most derived characteristics. So the mouse and the chimp would be more closely related than, for instance, the mouse to the bird or even the mouse to the lizard, the mouse and the chimp would have more in common. And it would definitely have more in common than, let's say, the perch and the bird. That's an obvious one. But when you're looking here, you say the most closely related individuals are the ones that share the most derived characteristics. Those derived characteristics are the things evolutionarily that they've adapted to use or have adapted to separate them out from everybody else, to make them better suited to their environment maybe than those around them, or a different environment now that's changed.